There's no doubt that this moment in history is exposing the underlying systemic injustices that persist across our country, and it will take all our movements working together to build a better future. Part of that better future requires that we reimagine an economy that actually works for people rather than simply the other way around. Our next guest is joining us all the way from New York City. Stephanie Kelton joins us as one of the world's leading economists, as well as an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. Her forthcoming book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy, shows how to break free of the flawed thinking that has hamstrung policymakers around the world. Stephanie is here to talk to us about why the deficit doesn't matter and how governments can afford to spend big in this moment to ensure that everyone receives the support that they need. She will be in conversation with Executive Director at Per Capita, Emma Dawson. Emma was formerly a Senior Advisor on Digital Inclusion at Telstra, Executive Director of the Institute for a Broadband-Enabled Society at the University of Melbourne, and a Senior Policy Advisor in the Rudd and Gillard governments. Please welcome Stephanie to the virtual stage and please with your questions.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening, my time this morning, your time. I'm just incredibly moved by the remarks that were just shared. And, while I'm going to talk a little bit about public finances and the way we think about the deficit, I just want to start by saying that, gratuitous is the worst possible form of suffering. In other words, when there are people who are hurting and communities that are underserved and problems that are pervasive across not just your economy, but economies around the world, and there are governments with the power to take action to redress some of these harms and damages that are being done. And the failure to act very often is kind of couched in this language that there just aren't resources to do everything that people would like and need done, that there are financial constraints, that governments, because of deficits and the national debt, just as much as they might like to provide additional assistance to help people who are hurting, that because of the deficit, because of the national debt, governments are essentially hamstrung. They're paralyzed. They're incapable of taking appropriate action. And so I want to start by addressing that rhetoric because it really is so pervasive. The idea that we are supposed to reward governments and praise them for putting the budget in balance or in surplus, right? For treating the budget very delicately, coddling it, delivering a budget surplus. And we're supposed to say to the federal government, good job, you have delivered on something that is significant and important for our nation. I think that's wrong. I think that for too many years, we have allowed governments to convince us that we should evaluate their successes based on what they achieve and deliver in terms of the budget outcome. Okay? The budget outcome is not the priority. It should not be the priority. It should not be the target or the focus of public policy. We should not be electing people to represent us if their priority in office is to take care of the budget outcome instead of to take care of real human outcomes, to look after their people, to look after their communities, and to look after the planet. So I will make a very strong case that the government can do much more and indeed must do much more. Communities are in distress across this country. Millions of people have taken to the street. And their distress signal is very loud. I mean, it's impossible to miss what they are telling us. In the midst of a global pandemic, people are putting themselves and their bodies on the line to express their distress, to say enough is enough. We have pain in our communities. We are in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. We want economic justice. We care about economic inequality. We want to see action in our communities with respect to policing, long-standing inequities, people who have been discarded and whose problems and voices have been dampened, and these people just haven't been heard. So people want action from the government. And I think that one ray of hope in this moment is that we are now all able to see that when the government decides that there is a priority, when they perceive a threat and an urgent need to act, that all of that stuff about balancing the budget and running a surplus goes right out the window. It's not a priority. The government has the capacity to spend to address problems like the global health pandemic and the ensuing economic fallout. And we need them to continue to act in those ways, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that people who lose jobs have income support. And I would go one further and suggest that the government ought to also stand ready to replace those jobs, to commit to providing jobs for those who lose jobs and end up unable to secure employment anywhere else in the economy. We can do so much more to address the problems that are in our economy with respect to joblessness and poverty, inequality, plugging holes in our healthcare and education systems, and expanding and designing new programs to look after people. Right? Because that's what public policy should be about. And that's what our elected officials should be concerning themselves with. And we're going to have to work with and through our elected officials to solve these problems. It's going to take pressure, right? It's going to take pressure from below being brought to bear to help change the narrative. We have to resist these excuses that we're handed all too often by our public officials that there is no money to address these problems. And I know the book was mentioned in the introduction, and while this is not a book talk, and I'm not going to talk much at all, at least initially, about the book, I want to make it clear that that should never be an acceptable excuse for the federal government of your country, of my country, and countries like ours, that is, countries that have what we would call a sovereign currency. These are currency issuing governments. Their fiscal capacity is unlimited. Okay, what constrains them is the capacity of the Australian economy in this case to safely absorb any new spending the government authorizes. In other words, they could spend too much. They could try to push the limit too far. And the punishment for that would be inflation, right? Accelerating prices, and nobody wants that. But the risks cannot be bankruptcy of the nation, bills coming due that you can't afford to pay, you wreck your country's finances. That's not what's going to happen. So we just need to reset the narrative so that we recognize the real limits, which are inflation and related to the supply capacity of the economy, and that we move away from this long-standing obsession we've had with balancing budgets and get to a place where we understand that the proper goal of government is to balance conditions in the broader economy in the service of the broadest interest of the population. So I think with that, we will have a bit of conversation, and then I think some Q&A is on the agenda. Thank you. I think Emma is coming up.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, Stephanie. Good to meet you virtually and to see everybody else here today at Progress. I'm Emma Dawson, and I'm joining you from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. I finished reading your book, your terrific book, just last night at about p.m., Stephanie. So thank you, and I can highly recommend it to anyone that's interested in this issue of debt and deficit and why we shouldn't worry about it. We are crunched for time, so I'm going to throw to some questions pretty quickly, but I just wanted to make some remarks myself about the Australian context. You talk in your book about your experience as the chief economist sitting in front of the Senate Budget Committee. And an interesting parallel occurred here yesterday when the chair of the Australian Parliament's Economics Committee put a tweet out in response to one of our leading economists, Alan Kohler, who has been slowly coming on board with this idea that we shouldn't worry about the deficit. And Tim Wilson, who's the chair of that committee, said, "Is that how Alan Kohler runs his personal finances? Doesn't worry about deficits and just increases his access to cash through personal loans?" He was piled onto pretty quickly by people that wanted to emphasise that, of course, the federal budget is nothing like a household budget. But the thing that I really wanted to draw out here is the idea, as you said, that balancing the budget is some great economic feat. Because, of course, what we should really care about is the economy and the real economy in which people live and work and how they can build a good life. A balanced economy is important. A balanced budget is deficit can be good at times, surplus can be good at other times. It's really, we should really be talking about the health of the economy and the way that that economy serves people and provides them with a good life. I just want to touch on the issue of inflation because it's often the criticism that people get into when you talk about spending, is that, that'll risk inflation. And actually, in that Twitter thread yesterday, our finance minister piled on and invoked the spectre of Venezuela, which is a constant thing that's brought up. Inflation hasn't been a problem for a long time now. In fact, it's certainly not a problem during a recession. We have the opposite issue. But since the GFC, we haven't seen inflation anywhere really in the developed world, and it's become a structural problem, hasn't it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Central banks around the world who have, of course, been put in charge of essentially managing inflation in their respective countries have been struggling for, in some cases, multiple decades to try to hit their own modest 2% inflation targets. I mean, Japan is an obvious example of a country that literally has spent more than 2 decades trying to generate inflation, trying to get prices to accelerate at a annual rate of 2% per annum, right? And they can't do it. So it turns out that it's pretty difficult to actually start up inflation in spite of the best efforts of governments and central banks around the world. The reality is we just don't run our economies hot enough to get the kind of demand pull inflation that you would expect might accompany an economy that's running on, I don't know I'm not a car person, but there's a saying like running on all pistons or something. I don't know. When you're firing on all your pistons. If you're really, pedal to the metal, and you are asking as much as it's possible for your economy to produce, and then you continue to push harder and harder, you're going to run up against supply constraints, and you're going to see some bottlenecks, and you're going to see some inflationary pressures. The problem is that we've been too timid. We run our macroeconomic policy with, intentionally with too much restraint. We hold ourselves back, which is to say we purposely live below our means as a nation. Our means are our real productive means. They're the people in our economy. They're the workers, people who want to work. They're the machines and the factories. It's the technology we have. And if we're not making full use of everything we have, we are living below our means. So that is in part, but not maybe even the most important reason that we haven't seen inflation, of any problematic kind for more than decades.
And of course, when we talk about living below our means, what that actually means is that there are people, real people in our countries, in our societies that aren't able to live to their full potential, that aren't able to access good jobs, secure jobs, and realise the benefits of living in what are, both in the US and Australia, very, very wealthy nations. So this has real world impacts for people and affects their ability to build a good life. We had a report out just last week on youth unemployment here in Australia and found that it's now reached the point where underutilisation of young people has reached over 60%. So that means almost 2 in 3 young Australians now don't have enough work. 40% of people aged between 25 and 34, even 2 years ago, were still in part-time, casual, or fixed-term jobs. And it's very hard then to start building a life in which you can get on the property market, feel secure enough to have a family. And so these are the effects of running the economy below capacity in order to balance the budget. One of the questions that's come through in our feed, I think it's very interesting, Michael Pulsford from the ACF has asked, who profits from this obsession with balanced budgets?
That's a good question. That is a very good question. So there are probably a lot of different actors and so forth in the economy who believe that it is in their financial interest to run an economy below its potential. Let's think about who doesn't benefit, and then we'll talk about who maybe does benefit or at least believes that they do. The economy as a whole does not benefit. Okay, if we are leaving trillions of dollars on the sideline, which is what it amounts to over a period of time, right? It is literally trillions of dollars. That is lost output, lost income, lost wealth, lost savings, not to mention the value of whatever could have been produced for communities by the tens or hundreds of millions of hours of contribution that could have been made. So why does the idea of full employment scare some folks? Okay, there are some employers who perhaps don't like the idea, especially in the US, the idea of creating a public option, a job guarantee that they believe would force them to raise wages, that it would put them in competition with better paying jobs that included some benefits, that employers like the idea that their employees feel tied to them because they get their health care through their employer. And so that is a reason that many workers don't leave even bad jobs because they're afraid to lose their health care. Along with that, they may believe that it's going to require some tax increases at some point. Now, that may not be a correct assumption, but for some people, the idea would be that they're going to end up having to pay more if the government were to run more ambitious fiscal policy. So I think fear of paying higher wages, fear of higher taxes, enjoying the idea that they have some power over workers, probably a few of the reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even in Australia, where we have universal healthcare, we've found in recent years that workers are much less willing to change jobs to move or to request higher wages. We've had very sluggish wage growth here for a long time. And I think one of the challenges that we have with this debate is recognising that profits and company profits and the value of assets held by shareholders and other owners of capital haven't suffered since the GFC. They have remained strong, but the share of productivity and of benefits of our economy going to labour has been in decline now for 30 years. We need to wrap up pretty soon, but I wanted to close this by putting my appeal out to the group here, which is part of this discussion. We hear all the time that saving is good, a surplus is good, and spending is bad. Spending is a bad thing. We hear this rhetoric all the time that, for example, our Labor Party, which is our progressive, equal to the Democrats here, is all about taxing and spending. I'm on a crusade to change that word spending and to start talking about investing, because, of course, what we need to do is invest in our economy, invest in our people, and public spending is all about investing in the future productive capacity of the economy, which is, if we do that correctly and in a way that's sustainable, we can grow the economy to the point where any so-called debt shrinks and becomes negligible. Is that something that you'd support?
Well, I certainly agree with you on the importance of spending wisely, or as you like to say it in your crusade, investing wisely. Of course, there are obvious candidates here where economists broadly agree that, making investments in things like education and R&D and infrastructure are some of the highest value kinds of government spending, because they in fact lead to higher productivity and, generally speaking, higher wages and higher prosperity longer term. So yeah, the place where I would probably separate a little bit from the ultimate goal. For me, the ratio of debt to GDP is not something I would pay attention to. I am not particularly interested in seeing the ratio itself decline as a metric of success or a policy goal. I think that, again, it's the real economy, stay focused on the real economy and the fiscal outcomes and metrics that we've been kind of conditioned to pay attention to and divert attention. We can largely,
No, I couldn't agree more. And I'm sorry, we do have to wrap this up, but it's been fantastic to hear from you today. And I will recommend to everybody, if you can get hold of the Deficit Myth, Stephanie's new book, give it a read. It's very accessible, it's very readable, and it will bust open a lot of those myths that we've been fed for so long about how our economy works and who it should work for. So thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for having me, everybody. I enjoyed it. Have a great conference.
Thank you.